Hello and welcome to Expositions. I'm Kevin Rhodes. I've had the opportunity to be part of numerous congregations of the Lord's Church over the years as I move with my family and have been called to asked to work in different places over time. And therefore I have many fond memories of the people with whom I've had the privilege of working side by side in the work of the Lord. I remember in my first work as a preacher, Bill Montgomery dropping by my office on his day off to visit, encourage me, and maybe to go visiting together. I remember working as a team at Harrisonville to install new windows in the church building and the skills you need and the teamwork necessary in order to do that time after time. I remember in Wellington helping Barry Clancy as he provided a number of finishing touches on our home and just streaming cable or helping as he put insulation in or other things. I remember recording a program in Morris, Alabama, similar to this one, with an elder of the church there. And I remember so many acts of kindness, friendship, and true love over the years as I've been at Granbury Street. It amazes me how close I've become with the brethren with whom I've worked for many years. But it shouldn't surprise me. That is exactly how God planned it. The Apostle John was the apostle whom Jesus loved, the disciple whom Jesus loved. He was Jesus' closest friend upon the earth. He was in the inner circle among the apostles, and he was the person to whom Jesus entrusted the care of his mother as he was dying on the cross. John's writings, the gospel account that bears his name, and the 3 epistles he penned in particular, are filled with admonitions in regard to love. One 2nd century historical account records that in John's later years, he would stand up before the congregation and simply say, "Brethren, love one another." But John himself provides a good picture of what it means to love in a very practical way. And he does so within the context of his 3rd epistle. So if you will, follow along as we read in 3 John. We will read first verses 1 through 4, and then the ending, verses 13 and 14. The elder to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth. Beloved, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health, just as your soul prospers. For I rejoiced greatly when brethren came and testified of the truth that is in you, just as you walk in the truth. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. Now verse 13 and 14. I had many things to write, but I do not wish to write to you with pen and ink. But I hope to see you shortly, and we shall speak face to face. Peace to you. Our friends greet you. Greet the friends by name. As we consider the example that John gives, as he writes to this beloved friend of his in the faith, we want to notice what characteristics really describe that relationship and what John did that made this so special. And the first thing we want to note is found here in verse 1, and it is this simple idea. Christian love has depth. Let's read again verse 1. The elder to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth. Now you immediately notice the repetition of the idea of love there, even though it uses different wording. But in John 13, 34 and 35, the background for this and so much of what John wrote are Jesus' own words when he wrote or said, recorded by John in John 13, 34 and 35, "A new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another, as I have loved you, that you love one another. By this shall all men know that you are my disciple, that you have love one for another." When we see, though, the opening, it tells us something about the nature of this love. And the first thing we see is that this love is personal. It's not a generic love. It's not a meaningless love. It is personal. When you notice in verse 1, he says, the elder to the beloved Gaius. Gaius is a Roman name of familiarity, meaning it's not the last name we would say. It's not the family name, Most people do not realize, for example, that Julius Caesar would not have been called Caesar except by those in his military that followed him. He would not have been called Julius, which was the family name by many people, but those close to him would have called him a more familiar name, which it also, we find, was Gaius. Gaius Julius Caesar. This was a name of those who were close, of people who knew you, who knew your habits, who cared about you deeply, and with whom you exchanged in a level that was far more personal and caring. And that tells us something about the relationship that John had with Gaius. This was not a formal letter, it was a personal letter to a personal friend. And that is how we need to think about love and how we ought to extend that love. In John 15 and verse 13, Jesus said, "Greater love hath no man than this, than to lay down his life for his friends." Now stop and think about what kind of love that requires and how you were to think of friends and who would be your friend, that you'd be willing to die if necessary for them. Jesus died for all of us. He was the friend we needed and treated us as friends. Here we see, in using the personal name, that within Christ, this ought to come as simply the way we are as His people, where we can be on that first name, close basis with one another, but it's also translated into a care that extends spiritually to where we're really willing to give and sacrifice for one another. But we need to do more than just have this as a theory where we think about it, oh yes, absolutely, I would sacrifice for my brethren, but to express it in a personal way too, and not just assume it. If we go back to 1 John chapter 4 and verse 7, we find this principle expressed where he said, "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God." The nature of this love then is something that is going to not just stay within, but it's going to abound within the relationship and define that relationship. When we see that he said here, "whom I love in truth," here we have someone that he cared about greatly. It was to the beloved Gaius. It was something he was willing to tell him, "how much you mean to me." To be beloved means you've actually placed your love upon them and that you care about them in that way, and you consider them and want them to think of themselves in terms of how much you care. We sometimes move away from this or stray from the idea of expressing love to brethren, and we don't need to do that. We need to be willing to talk in ways that express love so that we can be acting in love, and that there won't be this emotional distance between us, that we so formalize our relationship on Sunday in an assembly setting that sometimes we let that bleed over into daily life to where there's this distance emotionally there. Instead, we should develop these relationships, express our love for one another so that we bring that closeness to the assembly and our worship together. Where we don't assume this closeness, it is something we know. He wanted Gaius to know that he really cared. And we need to make sure that we don't just think people should assume we care because we're Christians together, but that we express that so that they know we care. This care, though, is based in character. It's a theme that John develops in his epistles. It's not based on the color of the skin. It's not based on having that in common. It's not based on culture, but rather on here's how love behaves. And therefore, when he is talking about Gaius, your beloved, I love you, Gaius would have understood from what Paul described as love, the sincerity of it, the depth of that love, the interest that he had for Gaius without any kind of reservation, without any kind of selfishness, of how far he was willing to go to help him, that he knew that John was not one who counted up and remembered all of the things Gaius had ever done wrong, but rather sought to help him do what was right. One that believed all things, hoped all things, and endured all things, and that was the kind of care he had for his friend and his fellow Christian. And that is the example that John sets that we really need to work at so that we'll be more like that. This is real love. It's not hypocritical, but whom I love in truth. There is no need to put up a false pretense of love. There's no need to go and be uncomfortable in expressing care. But there's an understanding there that is real, and it's backed up by day-to-day interaction whenever they were together. And that's how we need to be as God's people. That if we truly have an unfeigned love of the brethren, 1 Peter chapter 2 or 1 and verse 22, then we need to make sure we take that to the point of where people know they can count on us. And that the expression of love and the expression of I will be there for you is never hollow, but that rather when that phone call or that text arrives that there's some need, we find a way to make it work to reaffirm by our behavior that the love is real. It's so easy to fall into the trap of online where it's easy to express in a moment immediate kind of care with a short maybe emoji of hands praying or of a heart to say I care. But we have to back that up, and to back it up with action in the real world every day. You matter as a person in need, in care, and I am here to help you. That's the kind of love all of us should have. That's what John was expressing to Gaius, and Gaius knew it was real because he knew John in a real way. The second thing we should note is found in verse 2. Christian love is interested in others. He writes, Beloved, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health, just as your soul prospers. In Philippians chapter 2, beginning in verse 3, there the Apostle Paul warns about the dangers of conceit and selfish ambition taking over and making the individual the topic and the focus of every conversation. What I'm interested in, you need to listen to. Everything needs to revolve around my interest, and that's why he follows it next in verse 4 in the New King James. Look not every man on his own interest, but every man also on the interest of others. There ought to be a concern for other people that is exhibited by the type of love that expresses interest in what they're dealing with in life. That can be positive, it could be negative, it could be just something that is going on that is at their time with their children, with their work, in this case with his health. But it is an interest that shows they've given thought and attention to you as an individual. And it's important for you to do for others as well, to express that interest so that the interaction of love and the relationships that are built are not built on a one-sided basis where it is all about one person, but rather in a true relationship, it is about your knowledge of one another and your equal concern for one another. You think about all God has done to show how He's interested in us, and then asks us and requires of us to do things to show how we're interested in Him. That is partially the expression of a healthy relationship. And so in our relationships, we need to be concerned about others' lives, about what's going on and what's interesting to them, and what's of interest and concern at that moment. In Romans 12 and verse 15, in contrast, Paul expresses it this way: Rejoice with them that do rejoice, weep with them that weep. So wherever someone falls emotionally at a moment, we ought to be cognizant of that fact. We ought to pay attention to how people are feeling. We ought to think ahead about what they're going through and therefore be ready to be right there with them instead of ignoring maybe how they feel. When someone's having a bad day, we should acknowledge that express perhaps some empathy and sympathy for them and help them feel better because we care about them. They may be doing great. Maybe they got a promotion or something happened with one of their kids that just makes them so excited. And we ought, because of our love for them, to immediately respond genuinely from the heart because it means as much to us because of our love for them that they're happy. Our real concern for others' lives, instead of today's self-absorption, selfie kind of culture, where we want to see what's happening for others, and that we don't do that in a jealous way, looking over and saying, oh, they do all this, they've got all these wonderful things, but in a way that we can rejoice with them. And that's expressed here in our text by John's expression of concern for Gaius' health. And we do that in general ways. A lot of times on Sunday mornings, we'll have the announcements, these people are sick, and if you're like me, you'll hear about what someone's going through, and it really can be difficult when you hear how bad some people have had it, or maybe a family is having a succession of problems, what they must be feeling at that moment. But do we take it to the next step of how can I help them feel better? It could be that we just need to be there for them, like Job needed people to be there, and then we need to refrain from their problem of saying the wrong thing. You think about Philippians chapter 2, verse 27, where Paul was concerned about the Philippians worrying about their brother Epaphroditus and saying, yes, he had been sick, but he's doing better. We ought to be concerned about others' health and their well-being. But more than that, just as what he says here in the text, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health, now listen carefully, just as your soul prospers. Now, couched within that, we find he is expressing an interest in Gaius' spiritual well-being. He has confidence in it. He is actually encouraging him by the way he words it. But that interest needs to be there, and sometimes that's what is lacking in our relationships. Remember in Luke 19 and verse 10, Jesus said, the Son of Man has come to seek and save that which was lost. That ought to be a core concern for all of us, and of being able to express that to one another, perhaps about a family member, perhaps about a mutual friend that's having difficulty spiritually, but that this ought to be partly what pulls us together, and that that concern is legitimate and can be expressed with great care. We continue and we notice in verses 3 and 4, Christian love loves righteousness. For I rejoiced greatly when brethren came and testified of the truth that is in you, just as you walk in the truth. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. It loves righteousness, loves the right, and therefore it expresses that kind of love as an example for here's what really matters and what gets me excited. People are doing what's right. In Philippians 4 verse 4, the Apostle Paul told those brethren, rejoice in the Lord always. And again I say, rejoice. Where did the Apostle Paul find joy? In those who were in the Lord and glad to be in the Lord. You know, truly, every report we receive regarding the righteousness of others should produce joy in our hearts. If our heart is for the spiritual, if our heart is for heaven, and if our heart is for God, then all those who are drawn into that and place their lives and build their lives around that, that ought to be a joyous occasion and something that pulls us together in great care and love. In Matthew 5 verse 6, Jesus described this in the Sermon on the Mount with one of the Beatitudes when he said, blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. And that really is the background for what he says later in chapter 6, verse 33, but seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. We find here that this priority and emphasis on righteousness ought to be what fuels our relationships. Christian love loves truth and loves those who love truth. Now notice again what he said. For I rejoiced greatly when brethren came and testified of the truth that is in you, just as you walk in the truth. There were people who came and were able to notice righteousness in the life of Gaius. righteousness enough to see it lived out, righteousness that was matching what God said to do. Remember in John 17, verse 17, it says, "Sanctify them through thy truth, thy word is truth." They were seeing that lived out, and they were able to testify that someone, Gaius, was matching his life to the truth that has been given. Isn't it any wonder then that Jesus could say in John 8, verse 32, that the whole idea of the truth was what mattered most? Because the truth shall make you free. That's what mattered. It has that power. And so in 2 John, verses 1 through 3, we found that love based upon truth was so central to real relationships. When we love truth and we love others, we should want them to be in harmony more than anything, the nature of our relationships. Now see this that we noticed from verse 4, "I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth." And here we find an echo of what he had said in the previous book in verse 4. "I rejoiced greatly that I found some of your children walking in truth as we received commandment from the Father." Clearly then, John found it important to express that when he saw other people, other Christians living up to the gospel message, it deserved comment and commendation. When we love truth and we love other people, when they come together and match and we see them striving to do their best to walk in the light, we should want to help them. We should want to encourage them, so much so that that is the greatest joy we know. When you really have a concern for others and you have a love for righteousness, nothing will matter more than to make sure that those other people you know are living like they should. But that begins by doing it yourself. It's a key. It's something that matters so much, but it depends on a mindset of righteousness and a love for others combining to make it matter. And so our expression to one another for the benefit of souls is always on righteousness in others, bringing great joy, harmony, and love together that makes fellowship possible and makes it flourish. The fourth thing I want us to notice is found in the last two verses of the book. So we skip ahead because this is still about John, and he says this, "I had many things to write, but I do not wish to write to you with pen and ink. But I hope to see you shortly, and we shall speak face to face. Peace to you. Our friends greet you. Greet the friends by name." In Romans 12 and verse 10, here is Paul once more emphasizing a similar point, where he says, "Be ye kindly affectioned one to another in brotherly love." He says, in honor, he says, preferring one another. Well, what is he pointing out here then? Seek friendships among other Christians. If we've recognized that righteousness matters that much to us, and others who are practicing righteousness deserve our commendation and our attention, then shouldn't that be at the forefront of how we go about life and what we're seeking among them? I hope so. That's the kind of friendship we should want, the friendship that we would value, Proverbs 17 and verse 17. But that means we have to be willing to develop those kinds of friendships. In Proverbs 18 and verse 24, it says that he hath friends with himself be friendly, and there is a friend that sticketh closer than a brother. That kind of closeness, a closeness that goes beyond family, it should remind us of David and Jonathan. Of those who were not related, they were more than related. They had a bond that was based upon a common commitment to what was right, a care for one another, and a closeness because they were on the same page, wanting the same things, and most of all to please God. So faith brought them together to develop a closeness that created care, that created a bond that was greater than family. Until you're willing to work for that, you cannot fully appreciate it. But once you've established these kind of relationships, you need to keep up the communication. These kind of relationships must be nurtured and cared for and strengthened over time, not taken for granted. In Proverbs 27, there are a number of verses that address this kind of relationship. In verse 6, it says, "Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful." Friendship that is faithful is based upon telling people what they need to hear, not just what they might want to hear. It's the evidence of a strong relationship. Verse 9, "Ointment and perfume delight the heart, and the sweetness of a man's friend gives delight by hearty counsel." You ever needed advice from someone you could really trust? That's what friends really should be there for. But remember, only those who have your best interest at heart and righteousness is their core being can really give the kind of counsel you'll need. A lot of times we rely on having the same experiences from the world, and because of that, that doesn't mean that we necessarily are going to get the best advice. Those who have righteousness, experience, and our best interest at heart will always be better off for us. In verse 14 of Proverbs 27, it says, "He who blesses his friend with a loud voice rising early in the morning, it will be counted a curse to him." Meaning, know your friends well enough to where you don't take advantage of them, where you're not abusing the relationship, but rather, as he says in verse 17, "As iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens the countenance of his friend." Not just in that sense of you're better off because of that friendship, though it includes that idea, but that you also make it where it's clearly visible in that interaction you have with one another. You know, sometimes when we talk about Christian love, we forget to be as practical in application as we ought to be. And yet James 1 verse 22 says, "Be ye doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves." So let's put it into action. Perhaps our problem is that we haven't thought much about what it really means to show our love for one another. We say we want to love one another. We feel we love one another. It's time we show it. And that means we do the things that love does. You can choose not to participate. You can choose not to be part of what goes on in the local congregation. But if you fail to be a part and to truly belong in every sense of that word, you're the one who's missing out. Many people misunderstand and miss out on Christian love. To them, it's just some distant thing. It's only about God, and they miss the benefits of true, full fellowship and relationship of family. What we must remember first, though, is that the best way to appreciate and enjoy Christian love is not to wait on others to express it to us. It is to learn how to give it ourselves. I'm Kevin Rhodes. Thank you for watching Expositions.